In the spring of 1847, a traveling physician named Dr. Samuel Whitmore arrived at Thornfield Plantation in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, to treat what the overseer described as a minor infection in one of the field hands. What he discovered in the quarters behind the tobacco barns would make him physically ill. He found a girl, perhaps 15 years old, covered in wounds that formed patterns, deliberate patterns, burns arranged in geometric shapes across her back, scars that spelled out words he couldn't bring himself to record in his medical journal. When he asked to examine her more thoroughly, the plantation owner, a man named Cornelius Ashford, politely but firmly declined. The doctor left that day and never returned to Thornfield. He also never reported what he saw because in Virginia in 1847, enslaved people were property, and what a man did with his property was his own business. 3 years later, Cornelius Ashford's body would be discovered in his study, separated into exactly 66 pieces, arranged in a circle around his desk. The girl responsible would become a ghost story whispered across Virginia for the next century. A story so disturbing that court records were sealed, newspaper accounts were deliberately vague, and an entire community conspired to bury the truth. Tonight we're uncovering what really happened to the girl they called Mercy, and why her revenge was so methodical, so calculated, that even hardened lawmen couldn't look at the evidence without turning away. Before we go deeper into this darkness, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a mirror held up to the ugliest parts of our past, and not everyone has the stomach to look directly at it. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Dinwiddie County stretched across Virginia's Piedmont region like a scar. Its red clay soil perfect for tobacco cultivation, and its proximity to Petersburg making it one of the wealthiest agricultural districts in the Commonwealth. By 1847, the county contained over 200 plantations, each one a self-contained world where white owners wielded absolute authority over the black men, women, and children they held in bondage. Thornfield Plantation occupied nearly 800 acres along the Nottoway River, its main house rising above the tobacco fields like a temple to wealth built on suffering. Cornelius Ashford was 47 years old when our story begins, a second-generation planter whose father had built Thornfield from a modest farm into one of the most profitable operations in the county. Cornelius had inherited the property at age 25 when his father succumbed to consumption, and in the 22 years since, he had tripled its value through careful management and ruthless efficiency. He was known among his peers as a shrewd businessman, a man who could calculate profit margins in his head and negotiate prices with the tobacco factors in Petersburg with remarkable skill. He was also known, though people spoke of it only in careful whispers, as a man with particular appetites. Cornelius stood 6 feet tall with the kind of lean, hard build that came from years of riding his property on horseback, personally supervising every aspect of plantation operations. His hair was dark brown, going gray at the temples, and he kept it cut short in the practical style of Virginia planters. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously, favoring dark coats and high collars that gave him an air of severe respectability. He had never married, which was unusual for a man of his wealth and standing. When asked about it, he would smile thinly and say that he had never found a woman who met his standards. What he didn't say, what everyone suspected but no one dared mention directly, was that marriage would interfere with the other arrangements he had made for himself. Thornfield operated with 132 enslaved people working the tobacco fields, the house, the stables, the workshops, and all the other enterprises that made the plantation function. The majority worked in the fields, their bodies bent over tobacco plants from dawn until dusk during growing season, their hands stained yellow from the nicotine in the leaves, their lungs slowly filling with the dust that would kill many of them before they reached 40. But Cornelius maintained a separate category of workers, people he personally selected from among new purchases or children born on the property. He called them his special projects. Everyone else called them the disappeared. The girl who would eventually be known as Mercy arrived at Thornfield in April of 1847, purchased at an estate auction in Nottoway County. The previous owner had died heavily in debt, and his entire property, land, livestock, and human beings was being liquidated to satisfy creditors. She was listed in the auction catalog as Item 73, Negro Girl, approximately 12 years of age, field hand, healthy, no known defects. The description was clinical, designed to convey information about merchandise, not a human being. Cornelius paid $420 for her, a reasonable price for a young female field hand. But he hadn't purchased her for field work. Her name, according to the bill of sale, was Mercy, though she would later insist this wasn't the name her mother had given her. Her real name had been taken from her when she was 7 years old, sold away from her family to settle gambling debts. Since then, she had been Mercy because her first new owner found it amusing to call her that while he beat her. The name stuck through 3 subsequent sales, becoming as much a part of her identity as the scars on her back. She was small for her age, thin in the way that spoke of chronic hunger rather than natural build, with dark eyes that had learned to show nothing, to reveal no thought or feeling that might provoke punishment. She had already survived 5 years in the particular hell that was childhood slavery. 5 years of learning that survival meant invisibility, that the only safety was in becoming so unremarkable, so compliant, that masters forgot you were even human. Cornelius saw something else in her. He saw exactly what he had been looking for. The first month at Thornfield, Mercy was assigned to the children's work gang, a group of young people too small for heavy field labor who performed lighter tasks around the plantation, weeding gardens, carrying water, feeding chickens, cleaning the yards. It was hard work but not brutal, and Mercy began to hope that perhaps this place would be better than what she had known before. She shared a cabin with 3 other girls near the quarters, slept on a straw pallet, ate her rations of cornmeal and salt pork, and tried to make herself useful enough to avoid notice. She didn't understand yet that avoiding notice was impossible, that Cornelius had already noticed her, that he had purchased her specifically because of qualities she didn't even know she possessed. In late May, Mercy was summoned to the main house. The overseer, a man named Garrett who managed the field operations, came to the quarters one evening and told her to wash herself and report to the big house at dawn. When she asked why, he looked at her with something that might have been pity, then turned away without answering. The other girls in her cabin said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. They knew what being summoned to the big house meant. They had seen others receive similar summons. They had noticed that those people often came back changed, if they came back at all. Mercy reported to the kitchen entrance at dawn, her hands shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. The head cook, a woman named Bess who had worked at Thornfield for 30 years, looked at her with an expression of carefully controlled sadness. "Master Ashford wants you working in the house now," Bess said quietly. "You'll be cleaning his private rooms, helping with his personal needs, attending to whatever he requires. You understand?" Mercy nodded, though she didn't understand, not really. Bess reached out and squeezed her shoulder briefly. "Keep your head down. Do exactly what he says. Don't never talk back. Don't cry where he can see. And no matter what happens, don't tell nobody nothing. You survive however you got to survive. You hear me?" "I hear you," Mercy whispered. The first week seemed almost normal. Mercy cleaned Cornelius's bedroom, his study, his private sitting room on the 2nd floor of the main house. She emptied chamber pots, changed linens, dusted furniture, swept floors. The work was lighter than field labor, and she ate better, receiving scraps from the meals prepared for Cornelius himself. She began to relax slightly, to think that perhaps the warnings had been exaggerated. Then one evening in early June, Cornelius called her into his study after supper. The room smelled of tobacco and lamp oil, its walls lined with leather-bound books that Mercy couldn't read. Cornelius sat behind a massive oak desk, his face illuminated by candlelight, his expression calm and thoughtful. "Come here," he said. Mercy approached the desk, keeping her eyes lowered as she had been taught. Cornelius studied her in silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then he spoke again, his voice quiet and conversational. "Do you know why I purchased you, Mercy?" "No, sir. Because you're special. You don't realize it yet, but you have qualities that interest me greatly." His hand reached out and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm going to teach you things, important things. Things that will make you useful to me in ways you can't currently imagine. You're going to learn obedience, true obedience. Not the surface compliance that you've been showing me, but something deeper, something fundamental. Do you understand?" Mercy didn't understand, but she nodded anyway, because that's what you did when masters asked questions. Cornelius smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. We'll begin your education tomorrow evening. You may go." That night, Lying on her pallet in the small room off the kitchen where house servants slept, Mercy felt fear settle into her bones like winter cold. She didn't know what education meant, but she knew it was nothing good. What happened over the following months would break most people completely. Cornelius's education was systematic, carefully planned, methodically executed. He kept detailed notebooks documenting his methods, his observations, his experiments in what he called the correction of the human will. Mercy was not his first student. She was number 9 in a series that stretched back over 15 years. The others had ended in various ways. Some had been sold away when they became too damaged for further use. Others had died, their deaths attributed to disease or accident. One had successfully hanged herself in the barn, though the official record listed her death as natural causes. Cornelius began with small things. Tests of obedience that seemed almost reasonable. Stand here for an hour without moving. Memorize this passage and recite it perfectly. Hold this heavy object until I tell you to put it down. The punishments for failure were initially minor. An extra hour of standing, a meal withheld, a slap across the face. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the demands escalated and the punishments intensified. By July, Mercy was spending every evening in Cornelius's study, subjected to exercises that had no purpose except to establish his absolute control. He would make her kneel on dried corn kernels until her knees bled, force her to copy Bible verses with her left hand, while he struck her right hand with a ruler each time she made a mistake. Position her in stress positions that made her muscles scream with agony, then add weights to increase the suffering when she began to adapt. Through it all, Cornelius maintained a facade of calm rationality. He never raised his voice, never seemed angry or out of control. He explained his actions as though teaching a difficult lesson to a slow student. This is for your own good. You need to learn submission. Resistance only makes things worse. If you would simply accept your position, none of this would be necessary. He kept those notebooks, filling page after page with observations about Mercy's responses to various stimuli. Subject demonstrates high pain tolerance, he wrote in neat handwriting. Requires increasingly severe correction to achieve desired compliance. Shows tendency toward dissociation during extended sessions. Must be careful not to push too far too quickly. Previous failures suggest patience is essential to successful conditioning. By August, Mercy had learned to leave her body during the sessions, to send her mind somewhere else while her physical form endured whatever Cornelius decided to inflict. She discovered she could float above the scene, watching from a distance as though it were happening to someone else. This dissociation was both survival mechanism and dangerous trap. It allowed her to endure the unendurable, but it also made her more pliable, more controllable, exactly what Cornelius wanted. The other house servants knew what was happening. They couldn't not know. They saw Mercy's careful movements, the way she winced when sitting, the hollow look in her eyes that got deeper every day. But what could they do? Speaking out meant punishment or worse. Interference meant implication in whatever resistance was attempted. So they did what enslaved people had done for generations. They looked away and whispered prayers and left small kindnesses where Mercy might find them. A piece of bread wrapped in cloth. A cup of water placed where she would see it. Tiny gestures that carried enormous risk and meant more than any grand action ever could. September brought a change that Mercy didn't immediately recognize as significant. Cornelius began teaching her to read, not from kindness or any desire to educate her, but because he had discovered that literacy created new opportunities for psychological torture. He would have her read passages aloud, then punish errors in pronunciation with creative cruelty, make her copy texts that described masters and servants, obedience and punishment, the divine order that supposedly justified slavery, force her to write her own confessions of wrongdoing, describing her failures and defects in careful script. The irony was lost on Cornelius, but not on Mercy. He was giving her a tool he didn't realize was a weapon. Every word she learned, every sentence she could decipher, was knowledge that might someday be useful. She didn't know how yet, but she filed the information away in the parts of her mind that were still hers, still untouched by his attempts to remake her. By October, something was shifting inside Mercy. The dissociation that had protected her was beginning to work against her. She would lose time, finding herself in places without remembering how she got there. She would discover injuries she couldn't recall receiving. Her grip on reality was loosening, and she knew with terrible clarity that she was approaching a breaking point. Either she would shatter completely, becoming exactly what Cornelius wanted, or she would have to do something drastic. There was no middle ground, no gradual improvement, no rescue coming. One night in late October, unable to sleep, Mercy slipped out of the house and walked to the quarters. She found Bess sitting outside her cabin, smoking a clay pipe in the darkness. The older woman didn't seem surprised to see her. "Can't sleep?" Bess asked quietly. "Can't do much of anything anymore," Mercy admitted. "Feel like I'm disappearing, like there's less and less of me every day." Bess was silent for a long moment, the pipe glowing red in the darkness. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother told me a story once about a man back in Africa who was captured and sold, put on a ship, brought across the ocean. He worked the rice fields down in Carolina, and every night he would look at the water and remember home. One day he just walked into the water and kept walking, walked until the water closed over his head. Walked all the way back to Africa," she said. That's what she believed anyway. Mercy considered this. "You think I should drown myself? Is that what you're saying?" "I'm saying," Bess replied carefully, "that sometimes people reach a point where they got to choose. You can let what's happening to you erase who you are. You can walk into the water like my grandmother's story, or you can find a third way, a way that nobody's thought of yet." "And what's that?" "I can't tell you that, child. If I knew, I would have done it myself long ago. But I can tell you this. Whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision. Make sure that one thing at least belongs to you and nobody else." That conversation planted something in Mercy's mind. A seed that would grow in darkness, fed by suffering, watered by rage, until it became something that even she didn't fully recognize. She began to pay attention differently, to notice things she had previously ignored. The layout of the house, Cornelius's routines and habits, the locations of tools and implements, the times when she was alone with him, the moments when he was vulnerable. She wasn't planning anything specific yet, but she was gathering information, the way an animal in a trap gathers information about the mechanism holding it, looking for the weak point, the leverage, the moment of opportunity. November arrived with unseasonable cold, frost glittering on the tobacco fields in the mornings, the Nottoway River running dark and swift with autumn rains. The harvest was complete, the tobacco packed and shipped to Petersburg, and the plantation settled into its winter rhythms. Less field work, more time for repairs and maintenance, and for Cornelius, more time for his special projects. The sessions in his study intensified. He seemed to sense that Mercy was reaching some critical point, that she was either about to break completely or needed to be pushed harder to achieve the breakthrough he was seeking. The punishments became more severe, the humiliations more elaborate, the experiments in pain and endurance more extreme, and Mercy kept gathering information. She learned that Cornelius kept the key to his study on a ring attached to his belt. She discovered that he drank heavily on Thursday nights, working through account books while consuming most of a bottle of whiskey. She noticed that he kept various tools on his desk, including a letter opener with a blade of Damascus steel, sharp enough to cut leather, heavy enough to serve as a weapon. She observed which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked on their hinges, which routes through the house were most likely to be deserted at different times of night. And slowly a plan began to form. December came to Dinwiddie County with bitter winds that rattled the windows of Thornfield's main house and sent enslaved people huddling around inadequate fires in their cabins. Mercy had been at the plantation for 8 months now, though it felt like 8 years. Or 8 lifetimes. Time had become strange for her, stretching and compressing in ways that made it difficult to track days or even weeks. She marked the passage of time by the phases of the moon and the progression of her injuries, watching old scars fade as new ones formed, a living map of Cornelius's systematic cruelty. But something else was changing too. The fog that had been descending over her mind, the dissociation that had threatened to erase her completely, was beginning to lift. Not because things were getting better, they were actually getting worse, but because she had made a decision. And that decision gave her something she hadn't had in months. Purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing. The difference was everything. On December 3rd, something happened that would accelerate Mercy's timeline. A visitor arrived at Thornfield, a slave trader named Hoskins who traveled through Virginia, purchasing enslaved people to sell in the Deep South. He arrived in a wagon accompanied by 2 assistants, all of them armed, all of them wearing the hard expressions of men accustomed to dealing in human suffering. Mercy was serving dinner that evening when she overheard the conversation between Cornelius and Hoskins in the dining room. The trader was explaining the current market conditions, how prices were particularly good for young workers headed to the cotton plantations in Mississippi and Alabama, getting so we can barely keep up with demand. Hoskins was saying, his voice carrying through the door where Mercy stood frozen. Cotton's booming. Planters down there are paying premium prices for anyone who can work. Don't much care about condition either as long as they got arms and legs. They work them hard down there, you understand. 5 years is about average before they're used up, but the profits make it worthwhile. Cornelius's response was quieter, but Mercy caught enough of it to understand. He was asking about prices for a girl, age 15 or so, house-trained, literate. Hoskins quoted a figure, $700, maybe $750 if she was in good condition. They discussed logistics, timing, the best route south, and Mercy understood with cold certainty that she was being sold. That Cornelius had tired of his special project and was preparing to dispose of her the way he had disposed of the others. She would be shipped to Mississippi or Alabama, worked to death in the cotton fields, dead within 5 years if she was lucky. Unless she acted first. That night, lying in her small room off the kitchen, Mercy reviewed her plan with new urgency. She had been thinking in terms of weeks, maybe a month, gathering more information, waiting for the perfect opportunity. But time had just collapsed. She needed to act soon, very soon, before Hoskins returned, before she found herself chained in a wagon heading south. The following days passed in a strange state of heightened awareness. Mercy moved through her duties with mechanical precision while her mind raced through scenarios and possibilities. She refined her plan, looking for flaws, calculating risks, preparing for contingencies. She also began saying goodbye to people, though she did it so subtly that no one realized what was happening. She thanked Bess for her kindness, told another house servant named Ruth that she appreciated her quiet friendship, left small gifts, a ribbon she had found, a smooth stone from the river, tokens that meant nothing to anyone else but represented Mercy's attempt to leave something behind, to mark her existence before she ceased to exist in any recognizable form, because she understood perfectly well that she wouldn't survive this. Even if her plan worked, even if she succeeded in what she was attempting, there was no escape, no running away to freedom. Virginia's patrol system was too efficient, the geography too hostile. A young black girl traveling alone would be captured within hours, returned for punishment that would make everything Cornelius had done seem mild by comparison. So survival wasn't the goal. Justice was the goal, making Cornelius pay for what he had done to her, to the others before her, to everyone who would come after if he wasn't stopped. That was worth dying for. That was worth whatever price would need to be paid. December 10th fell on a Thursday, and Thursdays meant whiskey and account books. Cornelius followed his routine with clockwork predictability. After supper, he retired to his study with a bottle, locked the door behind him, and spent the next several hours reviewing the plantation's financial records while drinking steadily. By 10 o'clock, he would be drunk enough to be careless, but not so drunk as to be unconscious. It was the narrow window Mercy had been waiting for. She prepared carefully. She wore her darkest dress, the one that wouldn't show blood. She made sure her hands were clean, her movements calm, her expression neutral. She couldn't afford to let anyone suspect what was coming. The other house servants had to have what would later be called plausible deniability. They had to be able to honestly say they saw nothing unusual, noticed nothing wrong, had no warning of what was about to happen. At 9:30, Mercy climbed the stairs to the second floor. The house was quiet, most of the other servants having retired to their quarters or their sleeping spaces. She walked down the hallway past portraits of Ashford ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress. She reached the study door and knocked softly. No answer. She knocked again, slightly louder. "Come in," Cornelius's voice called, slurred just enough to confirm he had been drinking. Mercy opened the door and stepped inside. The study was warm, heated by a fire burning in the fireplace. Oil lamps cast wavering shadows across walls lined with books and hunting trophies, the heads of deer and wild boar that Cornelius had killed for sport. He sat behind his desk, the account ledger open in front of him, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. His collar was loosened, his jacket removed, a rare informality that indicated his guard was down. Ah, Mercy. He looked up with bloodshot eyes. Good timing. I need you to fetch me another bottle from the cabinet. This one seems to have developed a hole. He laughed at his own joke, the sound harsh and humorless. Mercy moved to the cabinet along the wall where Cornelius kept his liquor supply. She opened it slowly, her hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Behind her, she could hear Cornelius returning to his ledger, muttering calculations under his breath. This was the moment. This was the choice. Everything that came next would flow from what she did in the next few seconds. She could fetch the bottle, continue playing her role, survive perhaps a few more weeks until Hoskins returned. Or she could turn around and do what needed to be done. Mercy's hand found the Damascus steel letter opener on the desk, exactly where she knew it would be. It was heavier than she expected, more substantial, more real. She picked it up, feeling its weight, its balance, its terrible potential. Cornelius was still focused on his ledger, his head bent, his neck exposed. Mercy moved behind him, silent as smoke, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath, the tobacco on his clothes. Time seemed to slow down. She could see individual hairs on the back of his neck, could hear the scratch of his pen on paper, could feel her own heartbeat like thunder in her ears. She raised the letter opener, positioned the point just below his ear, and drove it forward with all the strength she possessed. But at the last instant, perhaps sensing movement, perhaps hearing something, Cornelius jerked sideways. The blade that should have entered his neck instead slashed across his ear and cheek, opening a deep cut that immediately began bleeding profusely. He roared with shock and pain, his chair toppling backward as he lunged to his feet. His hand went to his face, came away covered in blood, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You," he gasped. "You dare." But Mercy didn't let him finish. She drove the letter opener into his stomach, feeling it punch through fabric and flesh, feeling the resistance of muscle and the give of softer tissue beneath. Cornelius doubled over, his hands clutching at the wound, and Mercy pulled the blade free and struck again, this time aiming for his chest. They struggled in terrible silence, both understanding instinctively that noise would bring others, would complicate what was already complicated beyond measure. Cornelius was larger, stronger, but he was drunk and wounded and completely unprepared for violence from someone he had broken so thoroughly, or thought he had broken. Mercy was small, weakened by months of inadequate food and systematic abuse, but she had something Cornelius lacked. Absolute commitment. She had nothing to lose, no future to protect, no life worth preserving. She had only this moment, this action, this chance to make him pay for everything he had done. They crashed into the bookshelf, volumes tumbling down around them. Into the desk, scattering papers and ledgers across the floor. Cornelius got his hands around Mercy's throat, his fingers digging into soft flesh, cutting off her air. Black spots danced in her vision. Her lungs burned. She was dying, she realized. Despite everything, despite her planning and preparation, he was still killing her. Still winning. But her hand still held the letter opener, and she drove it into his side, into his ribs, feeling the blade scrape against bone. Once, twice, 3 times. His grip weakened. His hands fell away from her throat. He collapsed to his knees, blood spreading across his white shirt in dark flowers, his breathing ragged and wet. Mercy stood over him, gasping for air, the letter opener dripping in her hand. This was it. This was the moment where she could stop, where she could run, where she could end this with Cornelius dead or dying and her chances of escape still theoretically possible. But she didn't stop, because this wasn't just about killing him. This was about something deeper, something that had been building inside her for 8 months of systematic torture. This was about reclaiming herself, about taking back everything he had stolen, about making absolutely certain that he could never hurt anyone else ever again. And it was about the number. 66. She didn't know why that number. It came to her whole and complete, as though it had been waiting in her mind all along. 66 pieces. 1 for every week she had endured him. 1 for every session in this study. 1 for every time she had dissociated and left her body to escape what he was doing to her. Cornelius was still alive, still conscious, looking up at her with eyes that now held something they had never held before. Fear. Real, helpless, desperate fear. "Please," he whispered, his voice wet with blood. "Please, But Mercy didn't want to hear it. She didn't want his pleas or his promises or his desperate bargaining. She stuffed a piece of cloth torn from her dress into his mouth, silencing him. Then she looked around the study, cataloging the tools available. The letter opener in her hand, a heavy brass candlestick on the desk, the fire poker leaning against the fireplace, a hunting knife hanging on the wall among the trophies. Various other implements scattered around the room. She had hours before anyone would check on Cornelius, hours before the morning bell, hours to complete the work she had started. What happened in that study over the next several hours would become legend, would be whispered about in quarters across Virginia, would make grown men pale and turn away when forced to describe it in legal proceedings. Because Mercy didn't just kill Cornelius Ashford. She dismantled him, methodically, precisely, with the same careful attention to detail that he had applied to his experiments in breaking her. She used the anatomical knowledge she had gained through suffering, knowing which parts of the body could withstand damage and which were vital, knowing how to maximize pain while minimizing the risk of premature death. She worked in silence, her face expressionless, her hands steady. And she counted. 1, 2, 3. Each separation was deliberate. Each piece was carefully placed. She arranged them in a circle around his desk, creating a pattern that would later be described as ritualistic, though it wasn't ritual. It was accounting. A ledger written in flesh and blood, an itemized list of everything he had done to her. Cornelius lived through most of it. That was important. That was essential. He needed to experience what he had inflicted, needed to understand the full weight of his actions, needed to feel the progression from person to pieces, the systematic reduction of self that he had specialized in. Mercy made sure he stayed conscious as long as possible, using techniques he himself had taught her, methods of pain management and physiological manipulation that kept the victim aware and suffering. When he finally died, somewhere past midnight, Mercy didn't feel satisfaction or relief. She felt nothing. The part of her capable of feeling had been carved away over 8 months in this very room. What remained was something else, something that operated on pure function, something that existed only to complete this specific task. She finished her work as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the study windows. 66 pieces arranged in a perfect circle, each one positioned with terrible care. In the center of the circle, she placed Cornelius's ledger books, the records of plantation finances that had been more important to him than any human suffering. Blood had soaked into the floorboards, creating dark stains that would never fully come out. The smell of it filled the room, metallic and overwhelming. Mercy stood in the doorway, looking back at what she had created. She felt distant from it, as though it were a scene from someone else's life, something she was observing rather than something she had done. She walked to Cornelius's washstand, cleaned her hands and face with water from the pitcher, removed her blood-soaked dress and replaced it with a clean one from the laundry she had brought up the previous day. She was methodical about this too, making sure no trace of blood remained on her skin, no obvious evidence on her clothing. Then she walked down the stairs, through the house, out the front door, and into the gray morning. She walked down the drive toward the main road, her bare feet leaving no prints on the frozen ground. She walked past the quarters where people were beginning to stir, past the tobacco barns and the stables, past all the infrastructure of plantation life. She walked until she reached the road, and there she stopped. She didn't try to run, didn't try to hide. She simply stood there waiting, the cleaned letter opener in her pocket, her face empty of everything except exhaustion. Because she had done what she came to do. She had taken back her agency. She had refused to be passive in her own destruction. And now she would face whatever came next with the same cold determination that had carried her through the night. The patrol found her 2 hours later. They had been summoned by the overseer Garrett, who had discovered the study door standing open and had looked inside. Had seen what Mercy had left behind, had run from the house vomiting, unable to process what his eyes had shown him. The patrollers approached Mercy with weapons drawn, clearly terrified despite their numbers and their authority. One of them, a man named Dawson, called out from a safe distance. "You, girl, what's your name?" "Mercy," she replied, her voice flat and emotionless. "And what have you done?" "I killed Cornelius Ashford. I killed him because he needed killing. I separated him into 66 pieces because that's how many pieces of me he took over 8 months. And I would do it again if I could." The patrollers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. This wasn't a situation their training had prepared them for. Finally, Dawson approached cautiously, as though Mercy were a dangerous animal rather than a 15-year-old girl. He bound her hands behind her back with rope, searched her and found the letter opener, then led her to their wagon. They took her to the Petersburg jail, a stone building that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. They put her in a cell by herself, locked the door, and left her there while they figured out what to do next. News of what had happened spread through Dinwiddie County like wildfire. The initial reports were fragmentary and contradictory. A slave had killed her master. Multiple slaves had been involved. It was a planned uprising. It was random violence. But as details emerged, as the full scope of what had been discovered in Cornelius's study became known, the narrative shifted. This wasn't simple murder. This was something else entirely, something that defied easy categorization. The county authorities faced an immediate crisis. Under Virginia law, enslaved people who murdered their masters were to be executed swiftly and publicly, their deaths serving as warnings to prevent future insurrection. But the circumstances of this case presented complications that made the usual procedures impossible to follow. First, there was the matter of Cornelius's notebooks. When authorities searched his study more thoroughly, after the remains had been removed and the blood had been scrubbed away as much as possible, they found detailed records spanning 15 years. Documentation of torture, descriptions of experiments, notes about previous victims, evidence of cruelty so systematic and so extreme that even hardened men found it difficult to read. The county prosecutor, a man named Talbot, brought the notebooks to the judge assigned to Mercy's case. "Your Honor," Talbot said, his face pale, "we have a serious problem. These documents, if they become public, will cause reactions we cannot control. Abolitionist newspapers will use them as propaganda. The enslaved population will be inflamed. Our entire social order could be called into question." Judge Morrison, 60 years old and thoroughly committed to the slave system that had made him wealthy, read through the notebooks with growing horror. "This cannot stand," he said finally. "These must be sealed. They are never to be referenced in any proceeding. They are never to leave this office. As far as the law is concerned, they do not exist." "But they provide context," Talbot protested. "They explain why she did what she did." "I don't care." Morrison's voice was hard. "Our system depends on absolute authority of masters over slaves. If we acknowledge that a master can be so cruel that violence against him becomes justified, even understandable, we undermine the entire foundation of our society. The girl murdered her master. That is the only relevant fact. Everything else is noise." So the notebooks were locked away in the judge's private safe, to be forgotten for the next century and a half. But there was still the question of what to do about Mercy, because the second complication was the enslaved community's response. Within days of Cornelius's death, enslaved people across Dinwiddie County began engaging in acts of quiet resistance. They worked slowly, broke tools, made mistakes. Nothing overt enough to be clearly rebellious, but enough to disrupt plantation operations significantly. And more concerning, they began to gather. Small groups at first, meeting in the woods after dark, then larger assemblies. Within a week, nearly 300 enslaved people had congregated in the forests south of the Nottoway River. They built fires, shared food, waited, they made no demands, issued no threats. They simply refused to return to work until something they called justice was done for the girl. And their presence terrified the white population in ways that open violence never could. The gathering in the woods represented something that Virginia's slave-owning class feared more than anything else. Not individual violence, which could be punished and used as example, but collective action. The specter of organized resistance. The hint that enslaved people might recognize their power in numbers and use it to challenge the system itself. County authorities responded with overwhelming force. Militia units were called up from Petersburg and surrounding areas. Patrols were tripled. Armed planters rode between plantations, searching for signs of conspiracy, interrogating anyone suspected of involvement in the assemblies. But the gathered people remained peaceful. They committed no violence, destroyed no property, made no explicit threats. They simply existed in a state of collective refusal. And that alone was enough to shake the foundations of order. On December 15th, 5 days after Cornelius's death, Judge Morrison convened an emergency meeting with the county's most prominent planters and officials. They gathered in the courthouse in Petersburg behind closed doors to discuss what everyone was calling the Ashford situation. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice grave, We face a crisis that requires careful handling. The girl must be punished, that is not in question. The law is clear, but we must also consider the broader implications of our actions. The room erupted in competing voices. Some demanded immediate execution, a public hanging that would send an unmistakable message about the consequences of violence against masters. Others urged caution, pointing out that such an act might trigger exactly the kind of widespread uprising they were trying to prevent. A planter named Rutherford, who owned a large property adjacent to Thornfield, stood and spoke with barely controlled anger. That girl butchered Cornelius like an animal. 66 pieces, they say. 66. We cannot let that stand. We cannot show weakness. If we don't execute her swiftly and publicly, every slave in Virginia will think they can murder their masters with impunity. But another voice, belonging to a merchant named Foster who had extensive dealings with northern businesses, offered a different perspective. And what happens when this story reaches the abolitionist newspapers? When they print accounts of what was found in Ashford's notebooks? When they describe what he did to that girl and 8 others before her? We'll hand them ammunition we can never take back. They'll use this to paint all of us as monsters. The debate raged for hours, opinions splitting between those who prioritized immediate punishment and those who feared the long-term consequences of how this case was handled. Finally, Morrison raised his hand for silence. Gentlemen, we need a solution that satisfies both law and prudence. The girl must face justice, but that justice must be conducted in a manner that minimizes further disruption. I propose a closed trial, no public access, no newspaper coverage. We hear the case, render judgment, and carry out sentence with all possible speed and discretion. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only 2 men dissented, and they were quickly silenced by the majority. The trial was scheduled for December 20th, just 10 days after Cornelius's death. Mercy would be tried in secret, convicted in secret, and her fate would be decided far from public view. But word of the closed trial leaked anyway, carried through the underground networks of communication that enslaved people had perfected over generations. The gatherings in the woods grew larger. More people left their plantations, risking severe punishment to join the assemblies. And something else was happening too. White residents of Petersburg, particularly poor whites who had no stake in the plantation system, began expressing unexpected sympathy for Mercy, not because they cared about enslaved people in general, but because rumors of what Cornelius had done resonated with their own experiences of powerlessness and abuse at the hands of the wealthy planter class. The whole situation was becoming dangerously complicated. On December 18th, 2 days before the scheduled trial, Mercy received an unexpected visitor in her cell. A lawyer named Edmund Graves appeared, claiming to have been appointed by the court to represent her. He was young, perhaps 30, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested either genuine idealism or dangerous naivety. "Mercy," he said, sitting on the wooden stool in her cell while she remained on her cot, "I need you to understand your situation. The court intends to convict you and sentence you to death. That outcome is essentially predetermined, but I may be able to argue for certain considerations that could affect how you're treated." Mercy looked at him with those hollow eyes that had seen too much. "Why would you do that? Why would you help me?" Graves was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I read the notebooks. I shouldn't have. They're supposed to be sealed. But I convinced the clerk to let me see them, and what I found," he paused, his face troubled. "What Ashford did to you and to the others before you, it was evil, pure evil. I'm not saying what you did was right. I'm not saying the law should condone it. But I understand why you did it, and I think I can help, at least a little." What he didn't tell Mercy was that he had also been threatened. That powerful interests had made clear his career would end if he pushed too hard, asked too many questions, made too much of a spectacle. His help would necessarily be limited, constrained by forces larger than his idealism. But it was something. The trial convened on December 20th in a small courtroom normally used for minor civil cases. Present were Judge Morrison, a prosecutor named Wilkes, the defense attorney Graves, and a jury of 12 white men selected from among property owners who could be trusted to reach the correct verdict. No members of the public were admitted. No journalists were allowed. The doors were guarded by armed deputies. Mercy sat at the defense table in a clean dress provided for the occasion, her hands folded in her lap, her face showing nothing. The proceedings began with Prosecutor Wilkes presenting his case. It was brutally simple. Cornelius Ashford had been murdered in his own home. His enslaved servant Mercy had been found nearby with the murder weapon. She had confessed freely. The evidence was overwhelming. The law was clear. Justice demanded her death. Wilkes called witnesses to establish basic facts. The overseer Garrett testified about discovering the body, though he refused to describe what he had seen in detail, saying only that it was the most disturbing sight of his life. Sheriff Dawson testified about finding Mercy on the road and her immediate confession. The coroner Harding provided medical testimony about the cause of death, speaking in clinical terms that obscured the true horror of what had been done. Through it all, Mercy sat silent, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. When Graves stood to present the defense, the entire courtroom tensed. This was the dangerous moment, the moment when everything they were trying to keep hidden might be exposed. But Graves had been thoroughly warned, and he was careful. He did not mention the notebooks, did not describe Cornelius's systematic torture, did not attempt to justify or excuse what Mercy had done. Instead, he made a narrow argument about her age and mental state. "Your Honor, gentlemen of the jury," Graves began, his voice measured, "I am not here to claim that my client is innocent. The facts are undisputed, but I ask you to consider the circumstances that led to this tragedy. This is a child, 15 years old. She has been in bondage her entire life, sold and resold multiple times, subjected to conditions that would break most adults. On the night in question, something in her mind broke. She acted not from malice or rebellion, but from a kind of madness born of suffering. She is not a threat to society. She is a deeply damaged child who needs mercy, not vengeance." It was a careful argument, designed to walk the line between defense and submission to authority. Graves was asking for leniency while acknowledging the system's right to punish. He was trying to save Mercy's life without challenging the fundamental structure of slavery itself. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within 30 days. Judge Morrison addressed Mercy directly for the first time. "Mercy, you have been found guilty of the murder of Cornelius Ashford. Do you have anything to say before I pronounce sentence?" This was Mercy's opportunity. The one moment when she could speak publicly, when her words would be recorded in the official transcript. She stood slowly, her slight frame seeming even smaller in the formal courtroom setting. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "I killed Cornelius Ashford. I would do it again. He took everything from me except the ability to act. So I acted. If that deserves death, then give me death. But don't pretend this is justice. Justice would be asking why he did what he did. Justice would be looking at those notebooks you've locked away. Justice would be counting all the people he destroyed before me. This isn't justice. This is just power protecting itself." The courtroom erupted. Morrison banged his gavel, calling for order. Graves tried to get Mercy to sit down, to stop talking, but she continued. "You want me to be sorry. You want me to beg for mercy. But I won't. I'm not sorry. I'm only sorry I couldn't save the others. I'm only sorry he had 15 years to do what he did before anyone stopped him. You can hang me. That's fine. I've been dead since I was 7 years old anyway. At least this way I die having done something that mattered." Morrison's face was purple with rage. "Remove her from this courtroom immediately, and strike her outburst from the record. It never happened. Do you understand? It never happened." Deputies grabbed Mercy and dragged her from the room. As she was pulled through the door, she caught Graves's eye. He looked stricken, torn between his role as officer of the court and his growing realization that everything about this case was fundamentally wrong. News of the conviction and sentence spread quickly, despite the closed trial. And the reaction was immediate and intense. The gatherings in the woods swelled to nearly 500 people. For the first time, explicit demands were made. They wanted Mercy's sentence commuted. They wanted the notebooks unsealed and made public. They wanted acknowledgement that what Cornelius had done was wrong. The authorities responded with increased force. More militia were brought in. Arrests were made, but the assembled people refused to disperse. Some planters began to panic, fearing that the standoff would escalate into open warfare. Emergency meetings were held. Strategies were debated. And slowly, reluctantly, some of Virginia's most powerful men began to realize they had miscalculated. On December 27th, a week after the trial, Judge Morrison received an unexpected visitor. A delegation of prominent planters, including Rutherford and 3 others, arrived at his home after dark. "Your Honor," Rutherford began without preamble, "we need to discuss the Ashford situation again. We have a problem that's getting worse every day." Morrison poured whiskey for his guests and settled into his chair. "What do you propose?" "We can't commute her sentence. That would be seen as weakness." One of the other planters, a man named Harrison, leaned forward. "We're not suggesting commuting her sentence. We're suggesting we execute it quietly and then make her disappear from the record. No public hanging. No spectacle. We take care of the matter privately, then announce that she died of illness in custody. Natural causes. We bury her in an unmarked grave and we close the case. But what about the assembled slaves?" Morrison asked. "What about their demands?" "We deal with them separately," Rutherford replied. "We offer concessions that don't undermine our authority. Better food rations, Christmas celebrations, small things that make them feel heard without actually changing anything fundamental. And we make it clear that anyone who remains in the woods after a certain date will be hunted down and punished. We give them a way to claim victory and return to their plantations with dignity." It was a cynical calculation, but it was also pragmatic. And Morrison, who had been losing sleep over the situation, was receptive. The meeting lasted late into the night, working out details, coordinating strategies, crafting the narrative that would be presented to the public. On December 30th, an announcement was made. The enslaved woman known as Mercy had died in custody of a sudden fever. Her remains had been buried in accordance with Christian practice. The matter of Cornelius Ashford's death was now closed. Simultaneously, plantation owners across the county announced improvements in conditions for their workers. Extra rations were distributed. Punishments were reduced. Small gestures that cost little but created the impression of responsiveness. And a message was sent to the gatherings in the woods. "Return to your plantations within 3 days and no punishment will be given. Remain, and you will be considered in rebellion and dealt with accordingly." The gambit worked mostly. The assembled people, recognizing that they had achieved as much as they were likely to achieve, began to disperse. Some remained in the woods, refusing to return, and they were hunted down over the following weeks. But the majority went back to their plantations, carrying with them the memory of what they had accomplished. They had forced the authorities to negotiate. They had proven that collective action could affect outcomes. It wasn't much, but it was something. But here's where the story becomes murky, where official records and oral history diverge, where truth becomes impossible to separate from legend. Because there's another version of what happened, a version whispered in quarters across Virginia for the next 100 years. A version that says Mercy didn't die in custody, that the fever story was cover for something else entirely. According to this version, Edmund Graves had been working behind the scenes with contacts in the abolitionist movement. That on the night of December 29th, under cover of darkness, Mercy was smuggled out of the Petersburg jail and hidden in a safe house. That over the following weeks, she was moved north through a network of sympathizers, traveling mostly at night, hidden in wagons and cellars and barns. That she eventually reached Pennsylvania, then New York, and finally crossed into Canada, where slavery had been abolished decades earlier. The stories vary in details but agree on essentials. Mercy survived. She took a new name, her third or fourth depending on how you counted. She lived quietly in a small town outside Toronto. She never married. Never spoke publicly about what had happened in Virginia. She worked as a seamstress, attended church, and lived an unremarkable life that was remarkable only in that it was hers, chosen and shaped by her own will. Some versions of the story say she lived into her 70s, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1902. Others claim she was younger when she passed, her health permanently damaged by what she had endured. But all the versions agree that she survived, that she escaped, that she found a measure of freedom that Virginia would never have granted her. Is it true? The historical record provides no clear answer. The official documents say she died in custody, but those same documents are filled with lies and omissions. The notebooks that detailed Cornelius's crimes were sealed and then mysteriously disappeared from the courthouse vault in the 1920s, either destroyed or stolen. The trial transcript was lost in a fire in 1867, though some suspect it was deliberately burned during Reconstruction. The cemetery records show no burial for anyone matching Mercy's description in late December 1853. Everything about this case seems designed to obscure rather than illuminate, to bury rather than reveal. What we do know for certain is what Mercy did on the night of December 10th. We know about the 66 pieces. We know about her confession. We know about the gathering in the woods and the crisis it created for Virginia's authorities. We know that something unprecedented happened, something that frightened powerful men enough that they went to extraordinary lengths to control the narrative. And we know that Mercy's story didn't end with her, whatever her actual fate. Her name became a whisper passed between enslaved people, a reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, agency was possible. That the most powerless person still possessed the capacity to act, to choose, to refuse the role that had been forced upon them. In the quarters of Virginia plantations, mothers would tell their daughters about the girl who had been pushed too far and had pushed back. About the girl who had refused to die quietly. About the girl who had made her tormentor understand exactly what he had done to her by doing it back to him, piece by piece, 66 times. The story was told as warning and as inspiration, as horror and as hope, as a reminder that there were limits to human endurance and consequences when those limits were crossed. If you're still with me, if you've made it this far into this dark corner of American history, then you understand something important. This isn't just a story about one girl and one cruel master. It's a story about power and powerlessness, about what happens when human beings are treated as property, about the violence inherent in slavery and the violence that sometimes erupts in response. Hit that like button and leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think Mercy survived? Do you believe the official story or the whispered legends? What would you have done in her position? And make sure you're subscribed to the Sealed Room, because there are more buried stories like this one. Stories that challenge us to confront the darkest parts of our history. Stories that deserve to be told. The years following 1853 saw Dinwiddie County return to its surface calm, the rhythms of plantation life resuming as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Tobacco grew in the fields. Enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk. Planters calculated profits and losses. The machinery of slavery ground forward with its usual brutal efficiency. But something had changed beneath that surface. Something subtle but undeniable. The story of Mercy and what she had done to Cornelius Ashford had entered the collective consciousness of enslaved communities across Virginia, spreading through networks of communication that white authorities could never fully monitor or control. And with that story came a shift in perspective, small but significant. In the decade that followed, Dinwiddie County experienced a series of incidents that authorities described as unusual. Planters who were known for exceptional cruelty found their barns burning under mysterious circumstances. Overseers who used the whip too freely suffered accidents, falling from horses or being injured by farm equipment in ways that seemed almost deliberate. Nothing that could be definitively tied to organized resistance, but enough to make the more observant planters nervous. Enough to suggest that the lesson of mercy had not been forgotten. That there were limits to what people would endure, and consequences for those who exceeded those limits. The Civil War came to Virginia in 1861, bringing with it chaos and opportunity. As Union forces pushed deeper into Confederate territory, enslaved people fled by the thousands, seeking freedom behind Union lines. Dinwiddie County saw its enslaved population decline dramatically as people voted with their feet, abandoning plantations to join the Great Exodus. Among those who fled were some of the people who had been at Thornfield in 1853, who had known Mercy, who had witnessed the aftermath of what she had done. They carried her story with them, sharing it with other refugees, with Union soldiers, with the Northern journalists who were documenting the collapse of slavery. And in those tellings, the story evolved and expanded, taking on mythic dimensions. Some versions had Mercy killing Cornelius with her bare hands, possessed by righteous fury that gave her supernatural strength. Others claimed she had been helped by spirits, by ancestors who had guided her actions and protected her from harm. Still others insisted she had been an agent of divine justice, chosen by God to punish a man whose sins had cried out to heaven. The truth, as always, was more complicated and more human than the myths. But the myths served a purpose. They transformed Mercy from a damaged girl who had committed an act of desperate violence into a symbol of resistance. A reminder that the enslaved were not passive victims, but human beings capable of action and choice. After the war, during the turbulent period of Reconstruction, the story of Mercy took on new significance. Freed people gathering in churches and schools would tell it to their children, contextualizing it within the broader narrative of slavery and liberation. She became part of the oral history passed down through generations, her name invoked alongside other figures of resistance like Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. But while Turner and Vesey had led organized rebellions, Mercy's resistance had been solitary and personal, which made it both more relatable and more disturbing. Anyone could imagine being pushed to that point. Anyone could understand the cold calculation that had led her to do what she did. In the 1870s, a northern journalist named Rebecca Hartwell traveled through Virginia collecting accounts from formerly enslaved people for a book she was writing about life under slavery. In Petersburg, she interviewed an elderly woman named Ruth who had been a house servant at Thornfield. Ruth's account, published in 1876 in a book called Voices from Bondage, provided one of the few detailed descriptions of what had happened. She was just a little thing, Ruth told Hartwell, her voice trembling with the memory. Quiet, kept to herself. But I could see it in her eyes. She was breaking. We all knew what Master Ashford was doing to her. We'd seen it before with others. And we knew how it would end. She'd be sold away or worked to death, or she'd take her own life. That's how it always ended. But she chose different. She chose to make him pay. And Lord help me, I can't say she was wrong. When Hartwell asked about the 66 pieces, Ruth's expression became distant. I didn't see it myself. They wouldn't let any of us in that room for days after. But I heard the men talking, the ones who had to clean it up. They said it was like she'd taken him apart with surgical precision. Like she knew exactly what she was doing. They said it took hours, that he was alive for most of it, that she made him feel everything, the way he'd made her feel everything. Hartwell's book caused a minor sensation when it was published, particularly in the North where abolitionist sentiment remained strong. But in the South, where white supremacists were working to restore their dominance through violence and intimidation, the book was banned and copies were publicly burned. The story of Mercy was too dangerous, too subversive to be allowed circulation. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, as the generation with direct memory of slavery passed away, Mercy's story began to fade from active telling. It survived in fragments, in disconnected anecdotes, in stories that had been told so many times they had become distorted almost beyond recognition. The name Mercy itself was sometimes forgotten, replaced by generic references to a girl or a young woman, or sometimes just she. But the essential elements persisted. The cruelty, the violence, the 66 pieces. The number especially seemed to stick in collective memory, appearing in various contexts across African American folklore and storytelling. By the 1920s, when the last people who had been enslaved were dying, the story existed primarily in academic archives and in the private memories of families who had passed it down through generations. Historians occasionally referenced it, usually in footnotes, as an example of resistance under slavery, but without access to the sealed documents, without the notebooks that had been hidden away and then lost. The full context remained obscured. In 1953, exactly 100 years after Mercy's Act, a historian named Dr. James Crawford was researching Virginia plantation records at the State Archives in Richmond. He came across a reference in a letter from a Petersburg lawyer to a colleague in Richmond, dated January 1854. The letter mentioned the Ashford case and referred to sealed documents that contained disturbing information about the deceased. Crawford became intrigued and began searching for more information. What he discovered was frustrating. The trial transcript was gone, destroyed in the 1867 fire. The notebooks had disappeared from the courthouse vault. The only surviving documents were oblique references in letters and journals, carefully worded to avoid explicit description. But Crawford was persistent. He tracked down descendants of people who had been at Thornfield. He searched through church records and cemetery registers. He interviewed elderly residents of Dinwiddie County whose grandparents had passed down stories. Slowly, painstakingly, he reconstructed the basic narrative. His findings were published in 1957 in a scholarly journal under the title Resistance and Retribution in Antebellum, Virginia, The Ashford Case. The article was dense with academic language and carefully hedged conclusions, but it represented the first serious attempt to document what had happened and place it in historical context. Crawford's research attracted some attention in academic circles, but failed to reach a broader audience. The story remained obscure, known primarily to specialists in slavery studies, until 1976, when a young filmmaker named Angela Morrison, inspired by Crawford's work, began production on a documentary about Mercy. Morrison traveled to Virginia, filmed interviews with descendants, recreated scenes from the story, and tried to bring Mercy's experience to life for a television audience. The documentary, titled 66 Pieces, aired on PBS in 1977 and reached millions of viewers. Suddenly, Mercy's story was back in public consciousness, debated in newspapers, and discussed in classrooms. The documentary sparked controversy. Some viewers praised it as an unflinching look at slavery's brutality and the human capacity for resistance. Others condemned it as too graphic, too disturbing for broadcast television. In Virginia, particularly in Dinwiddie County, reaction was mixed. Some residents were angry that the documentary presented their region's history in such a negative light. Others, particularly members of the Black community, felt vindicated that this long-buried story was finally being acknowledged. Morrison received both praise and death threats. Her documentary was banned in several southern states, but it also inspired a new generation of researchers and storytellers to investigate other hidden or forgotten stories from slavery, to look beyond the sanitized versions of history and confront the full reality of what enslavement actually meant in human terms. In the decades since, Mercy's story has been referenced in books, plays, songs, and academic papers. It has become part of the broader conversation about slavery, trauma, and resistance, and it continues to provoke strong reactions because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Was Mercy justified in what she did? From a legal standpoint, clearly not. Murder is murder regardless of provocation. But from a moral standpoint, from a human standpoint, the question becomes more complex. What would you have done in her position? After months of systematic torture, after being told you were about to be sold to certain death, after exhausting every other possible avenue of resistance or escape, would you have simply accepted your fate? Or would you have acted as Mercy acted, choosing to control at least the manner and meaning of your own destruction? These aren't easy questions. They don't have comfortable answers. And that's precisely why the story matters. It challenges us to think beyond abstract principles and consider the lived reality of people trapped in impossible situations. It asks us to extend empathy even to actions we might find horrifying, to recognize that moral clarity is often a luxury available only to those who have never been pushed to absolute extremes. There's another dimension to this story that deserves attention. The question of what happened to Cornelius's other victims. The notebooks, before they disappeared, allegedly documented torture and abuse of at least 8 other enslaved people over 15 years. Most of them were never named in surviving records. Their stories were never told. Their suffering was never acknowledged. They exist only as shadows, as fragmentary references, as evidence of crimes that were never prosecuted because under the law of that time and place, there was no crime. You couldn't murder property. You couldn't torture property. You could only damage it, and even that was your own business as long as it didn't affect your neighbors. This is the larger context that makes Mercy's story so significant. She wasn't just reacting to what had been done to her. She was avenging all those who had come before, all those who had suffered and died without ever having the opportunity or the capacity to fight back. Her 66 pieces represented not just her own suffering but the accumulated weight of all that unacknowledged pain. And what of Thornfield itself? The plantation was sold and subdivided in the years after the Civil War. The main house where Cornelius had lived and died was torn down in 1889, the materials salvaged for other buildings. The land was farmed for another century, passing through various owners, none of whom stayed very long. Local residents claimed the property was cursed, that strange things happened there. Crops failed, animals sickened. People reported hearing sounds at night, voices calling out, sounds that might have been wind but might have been something else. In 1994, a developer purchased the property with plans to build a subdivision. During excavation work, construction crews uncovered what appeared to be unmarked graves. Work stopped while archaeologists examined the site. They found evidence of at least 30 burials, all of them consistent with enslaved people who had died in the mid-19th century. None of them had markers. None of them had been recorded in any official register. The discovery sparked a community effort to memorialize the site. A small monument was erected, listing the names of enslaved people who had been documented as living at Thornfield based on available records. Mercy's name was included, though with a question mark because her fate remained officially uncertain. The monument stands today on a corner of what is now a small public park. visited occasionally by historians and descendants and people like those of you watching the sealed room right now, drawn by the dark magnetism of stories that refuse to stay buried. The question that haunts this entire narrative is whether Mercy survived. Did she die in that Petersburg jail as official records claim, or did she escape to the north, living out her days in anonymous freedom? The evidence is ambiguous enough to support either conclusion. Those who believe she died point to the lack of any confirmed sightings or records of her after December 1853. They argue that the escape story is wishful thinking, a comforting myth that allows us to believe she found justice. Those who believe she survived point to inconsistencies in the official record, to testimony from people who claim to have helped her escape, to sightings reported in Pennsylvania and New York in the years following her supposed death. The truth is, we'll probably never know for certain. The people who would have known are long dead. The documents that might have provided answers are lost or destroyed. We're left with fragments and possibilities, with stories that might be truth or might be legend or might be some combination of both. But in a way, the ambiguity is fitting. Mercy's entire life was defined by other people deciding who she was, what she was worth, what would happen to her. The one thing that was definitively hers was her action on the night of December 10th, 1850, that one night when she took control, when she acted according to her own will rather than someone else's command. Whether she lived or died afterwards, whether she found freedom or ended in an unmarked grave, that action remains. That choice remains. Those 66 pieces remain as testimony to the fact that she existed, that she mattered, that she refused to be erased. There's a broader lesson here about how we remember difficult history. For more than a century, Mercy's story was actively suppressed. The people in power at the time recognized that it was dangerous, that it challenged narratives they needed to maintain about slavery being a benign institution, about enslaved people being content with their condition, about violence only coming from those who wanted to disrupt a peaceful social order. So they sealed the documents, closed the trial, spread false stories about what had happened. And for a long time it worked. The story was buried, but it didn't stay buried. It survived in oral tradition. It survived in fragmentary records. It survived because it meant something to people, because it represented something important about human nature and human endurance. And eventually, despite all efforts to suppress it, the story came back to light. That pattern repeats throughout history. The powerful try to control the narrative, to decide what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. And sometimes they succeed for a while, but the truth has a stubborn way of resurfacing, often in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. The stories we bury don't disappear. They wait. And when conditions are right, when someone cares enough to dig, they emerge again, sometimes changed by time and retelling, but still carrying their essential truth. Mercy's story is one of thousands like it. Thousands of instances of resistance and rebellion and refusal that happened throughout the centuries of slavery in America. Most of them were smaller, less dramatic, a tool deliberately broken. Work performed slowly. A master's food poisoned just enough to make him sick, but not enough to prove intent. Countless small acts of sabotage and resistance that white owners attributed to incompetence or malice, but that were actually assertions of agency by people who had almost no other way to assert it. And occasionally, the resistance was more dramatic, more violent, more impossible to ignore. Those are the stories that got recorded, if only because they frightened the powerful enough to warrant documentation. But even then, the records were often sealed, destroyed, or deliberately falsified. We're left trying to reconstruct what happened from fragments and omissions, from what people were afraid to write down as much as from what they did write down. What makes Mercy's story particularly haunting is its intimacy. This wasn't a large-scale rebellion. This wasn't a group of enslaved people rising up against their oppressors. This was one girl and one man, alone in a study in the middle of the night. It was personal, and the violence she inflicted was calculated to mirror the violence he had inflicted on her, methodical rather than frenzied, systematic rather than chaotic. She didn't kill him in a moment of rage. She dismantled him over hours, with the same careful attention to detail that he had used in his experiments on her. There's something almost unbearable about that image. Not just the violence itself, though that's disturbing enough, but the psychological state it implies, the coldness, the determination, the absolute commitment to seeing it through regardless of consequence. It suggests someone who had moved beyond fear, beyond hope, beyond everything except the need to act. And that might be the most frightening thing about the story. Not that Mercy was violent, but that she had been pushed to a point where violence became logical, where the calculated infliction of suffering became a rational response to the suffering she had endured. We want to believe that wouldn't happen to us, that we would find another way, that we would maintain our humanity even under extreme duress. But Mercy probably believed that too, right up until the moment she didn't. That's the uncomfortable truth this story forces us to confront. We all like to think we know where our lines are, what we would or wouldn't do under pressure, but we don't really know until we're tested. And most of us, thank God, will never be tested the way Mercy was tested. So we can judge her actions from a position of safety and comfort. We can debate the ethics of what she did. We can argue about whether she was justified or whether she crossed a moral line that should never be crossed regardless of provocation. But those debates happen in the abstract. They happen in a space where we have the luxury of contemplating moral philosophy rather than survival. Mercy didn't have that luxury. She had a choice between dying slowly or dying quickly, between passive destruction or active resistance. And she chose. Whether that choice was right or wrong, whether it was justified or excessive, whether it represented justice or just revenge, those are questions we can debate forever without reaching consensus. What we can't debate is that it happened, that a 15-year-old girl, after months of systematic torture, killed the man who tortured her and did it in a way that ensured he experienced everything he had inflicted on others. That 66 pieces of Cornelius Ashford were found arranged in a circle in his study, that the case was so disturbing that authorities went to extraordinary lengths to suppress information about it, that a community of enslaved people rose up in quiet resistance, demanding something they called justice, and forced the powerful to negotiate. These are facts, as solid as any facts can be given the gaps and contradictions in the historical record. And they deserve to be remembered. Not because the story is uplifting or inspiring, it's not, but because it's true, because it happened, because mercy existed and mattered and acted, and because forgetting inconvenient truths doesn't make them go away. It just ensures we'll be blindsided when similar situations arise. So what do we do with this story? How do we carry it forward? I think we start by acknowledging its complexity, by resisting the urge to simplify it into a tale of pure heroism or pure horror. Mercy was neither hero nor monster. She was a human being pushed beyond endurance, who responded with violence that reflected the violence inflicted on her. We can understand that without endorsing it. We can recognize her humanity without excusing her actions. We can hold multiple truths simultaneously. That slavery was evil, that what Cornelius did was evil, that what Mercy did was horrifying, and that all of this happened. All of it is part of our history. All of it shaped the country we live in today. We also need to remember that Mercy's story, as extraordinary as it was, represents something ordinary under slavery. Not the specific details, those were unusual, but the underlying dynamic of absolute power corrupting absolutely, of human beings treated as property, of violence breeding violence. That was common. That was the system. Mercy's response was unusual. But the conditions that produced her response were standard operating procedure. Every enslaved person in America lived under threat of violence that could be inflicted with impunity. Every enslaved woman faced the additional threat of sexual violence, also with impunity. The law provided no protection. The culture provided no sympathy. You survived however you could, and sometimes surviving meant doing things that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. These were conditions of absolute oppression maintained by absolute violence. And occasionally that violence was returned. Finally, we need to acknowledge what we don't know. We don't know Mercy's real name, the one her mother gave her. We don't know if she survived past December 1853. We don't know what happened to most of Cornelius's other victims. We don't know what was in those notebooks beyond fragmentary descriptions. We don't know. And that ignorance is itself part of the legacy of slavery, the systematic destruction of records, the deliberate obscuring of truth, the erasure of people who were considered property rather than persons. But even with all we don't know, we know enough. We know that a girl named Mercy, whose real name is lost to history, existed. We know she endured horrors we can barely imagine. We know she reached a breaking point and acted on it with methodical fury. We know her action terrified the powerful and inspired the powerless. We know her story survived despite every effort to bury it. And we know that nearly 200 years later, we're still grappling with what it means still trying to understand what it tells us about humanity at its worst and its most desperate. That has to count for something. That has to mean that Mercy, whatever her ultimate fate, achieved something beyond survival. She forced people to see. She forced people to remember. She refused to disappear quietly. And in a system designed to erase her completely, that refusal was itself a form of victory. So what do you think? Do you believe Mercy survived and escaped to freedom? Or did she die in that jail cell, another victim of the system she tried to resist? Do you think her actions were justified given what she endured? Or did she cross a line that should never be crossed regardless of provocation? Would you have made the same choice in her position? Or would you have chosen differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective on this complicated, disturbing, and ultimately human story. And if you found value in this deep dive into one of America's darkest chapters, hit that subscribe button. Here at the Sealed Room, we specialize in unearthing the stories that were buried for a reason, the histories that make people uncomfortable, the truths that challenge the narratives we've been told. Because uncomfortable or not, these stories deserve to be remembered. The people who lived them deserve to be acknowledged. And we, the living, deserve to know the full truth of where we came from, even when that truth is ugly. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into the past. Thank you for being willing to sit with discomfort and ambiguity. Thank you for caring about a girl named Mercy who lived nearly 200 years ago and whose story almost disappeared forever. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another investigation into history's sealed rooms. And remember, the past isn't really past. It lives in us, shapes us, speaks to us, if we're willing to listen. I'll see you in the next one.